All right, we're off and running in the OZTalmud Beit Midrash. The crowd over here, I don't have the little camera plugged in today, but Ari is here in the Beit Midrash. As you know, Ari, you can take your Zoom off now.
Okay.
Because we're getting double sound.
Yeah, I am.
There. You're off the screen now, but you're in person. Though you could sign back in without the audio if you want people to see your face. And hold your phone in front of your face so people can see you, because I don't have a little camera today. But you don't have to. You have to trust me, Ari's. I got regrets from a few folks tonight who are not around the table. So shalom to them, and they all sent their shaloms to the rest of the crew. And we are going to pick up in the Gemara in our sugya, in the courtroom drama that is unfolding after the Roman Empire and after the Persian Empire were dismissed by God for not following the Torah and not having good claims that they did enough for the Jews. And so here we go. The rest of the nations of the world are now coming, and they're going to plead their case. So here we are, and we are on page 2b still in AvodahZarahpp, and we're just at this point where the Gemara says, but once the other nations saw that they basically couldn't get God to give them any kind of credit, and God condemns them, in other words, for not really doing their part in following Torah and not really doing good for the Jews either. Why would they even come and claim that they did anything good? And so here's the difference. Savri, they thought, Hanach ishtabedu b'Yisrael, v'anan lo shi'abedenu Yisrael. Those empires subjugated the Jews, but we did not actually enslave them. We didn't subjugate them. We didn't conquer them in the same way that those other empires did. But what's different about those Rome and Persia who were singled out explicitly versus those others who we're going to come now? And the Gemara in its presentation doesn't really give you individual case by individual case. Why are we going to just summarize it that basically it's done in general terms? So the rest of the nations of the world came. Well, why don't we get the whole drama between God and Rome, like that between God and Persia? The internal question of the Gemara asks, what's the deal here with the way that we're going to be presented with this? And we said last time it's because with regard to Rome and Persia that their kingship extends until the coming of the Messiah. And maybe it was meaning that we were feeling that they were particularly oppressive as part of our history. And maybe it means that the nature of those kinds of empires would be forever in the world. There would be those who would come and be hegemonic and leave you in place. Those who would become hegemonic and mix you up with their populations. Those who would exile you, by the way, are not included. The Babylonians were not singled out here. But we know by mentioning Rome and Persia, by the way, that we're kind of mentioning Babylonian, which I kind of referred to the last time, but I just want to say that by way of literary trope, if you have Persia, who ultimately could claim they even let the Jews back, you know that Persia kind of overcame Babylonia, and Babylonians had so deeply exiled and enslaved the Jewish people that you can't kind of miss that they're somewhere in there. And then moving forward up to the Romans, we have all of what unfolded with what we know as the Second Temple destruction and the kind of continuation of the Greco-Roman reality that we face. So if you really want to talk about Rome, you also historically are remembering the Seleucid Empire, which was post-Alexander the Great. And so all of that comes into focus when we talk about that time. And actually, for the Jews, if you really think about it, those are the nations that we kind of either use symbolically to represent our foes, and all of the oppression throughout history. And we have still the consciousness, because the texts from this age present these empires, just like we're hearing about now. And a lot of the Midrash will tell you that it was really, an accounting for the Egyptians, who are not here, by the way, as well. So we just want to say who's not here. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Seleucid, Greco-Roman kind of empire who overcame until the Maccabees, and the Romans, and those are the mainstay kind of. The rest of them, let's see what we mean. What's going to happen with the rest of the peoples? Omrim lefanav. The nations are going to now come to say before God, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe. Klum natata lanu v'lo kibalnuha. Did you give us the Torah and we didn't accept it? In other words, did you ever try to give us the Torah? You're asking whether or not we fulfilled your Torah, but did you ever really, quote unquote, gift us, convince us that this Torah was ours to have to fulfill, establish, understand? No, why would we even think that? In other words, there's one svar here that goes so far as to say, I wouldn't even think that the Torah is shayechetli. I wouldn't think that the Torah is connected to me. Why could there be a question as to whether or not the nations of the world should follow the Torah? Now, inherently here is a position within the Jewish approach to morality in the world and the mindset of Jewish people who, when it comes to the Isaiah verse that we shall be a light to the nations, how we really believe the rest of the world should or could believe, behave, and engage in defining a moral code. And so what do we get here? We get the rabbinic thinking that, sure, everybody should be interested in Torah. Everybody could be basing their moral outlooks and their codes of law on Torah legislation, on Torah in the largest sense and the smallest sense. Thou shalt not do this, or thou shalt derive from one major principle. Don't leave a lost item and ignore it. You shall surely return it to your brother. Okay, let's codify what it means to be a good citizen in a moral kind of civil society. We're not just talking about don't steal and don't murder. We're talking about learning at the very core what it means to be a decent citizen of the world, because we're talking in the context of umot ha'olam. We're talking about the context of nations. We're talking about the context of peoples. We're talking about the greater context of what does it mean to establish the good life, the society. And here we see that obviously the rabbis at least put in God's mind, right? And as a way of really stating their own outlook, their own philosophy about what the nations of the world are responsible for. You have this Torah that you could very well looked into for a lot of guidance, and God's going to put you on trial for it in the end, because there's a lot of good ideas here. There's a lot of serious moral framework and serious moral grounding for your entire society. So the question is, did you really take it seriously? Did you really engage it? Did you really embrace it? Did you really use it for the benefit of your own society as well as Jewish society? So that is stitched into the notion of this sugya. But the nations of the world are going to say, we know the story when it came to you and the Jews, God. Listen to how they're going to quote the Midrash to God. By the way, nations of the world are quoting Midrash right back to God. That in and of itself proves they obviously knew a little Torah. In a certain sense, they give away the fact that some people actually knew about Torah. They knew enough of Torah. They kind of know the lore. They kind of know the situation. So watch what happens. This is a cool move within the sugya itself. Umi matze lamemar hachi. And the Gemara says, And can one say that they were never offered the Torah? V'hachativ vayomar Hashem Sinai AvodahZarahpp2 lamo uchativ Elohav miteiman yavo ma ba'e b'seir ma ba'e b'faran. So isn't it written that the Lord came from Sinai and rose from Seir unto them? I just want a technical break. I'm getting messages that the system is unstable. And I'm set up on some system that Helene put as a workaround because the system somehow in OZTalmud is not working right now. If we get cut off, I don't know how to get us back. And my phone has the same problem in OZTalmud, unlike Ari's phone, by the way, that didn't have the problem. That's the last attempt. If we get cut off here on the computer, I'm glad to call on Zoom with Ari's phone if he'll let me,
of course,
and continue along a little learning. But I won't be able to do a share like I'm doing now. So I'm just technical note. I apologize in advance if we have these technical troubles tonight. Okay. And so the nations are saying, did you really try to give us this Torah? I mean, we never accepted it. By the way, we never even had the chance to accept or reject it. Gemara comes and says, in fact, there's lore about this. As if the nations knew the Midrash that God was in Seir and God was in Paran. And Gemara says, so what's with Seir and Paran? Why'd you give me verses about these two places where these other peoples of the world live? That's why you must have given me these two verses, because other peoples of the world live there. So let's see what he says. Rabbi Yochanan has the Midrash on that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan milamed shehechazira HaKadosh Baruch Hu al kol umma v'lashon v'lo kibluha ad sheba etzel Yisrael v'kibluha. Rabbi Yochanan says, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be God, took the Torah around to every nation, those who speak every language, and they did not accept Torah. Lo kibluha. Until what? God came to the Jewish people and they accepted it. So here, the tradition is that there is some rejection. But they want to know, did you really do that? The nations of the world have said in our Gemara and in our text here. Elahachi Amri. Rather, this is what they say. Klum kibalu noha v'lo kaimuha. This is what the nations of the world really say. Did we accept the Torah and then not fulfill its mitzvot? Are you blaming us? You can't blame us. Did we accept Torah and then not fulfill the mitzvahs? Who are they accusing in that one little line? Read it differently. Are you saying about us that we accepted the Torah and didn't fulfill its mitzvot? There's some foreshadowing here into who's now going to be put on trial by the nations of the world. Because who accepts the Torah and doesn't really fulfill all the mitzvahs? It's like a perennial Jewish problem. This is like the rabbinic way, like pumfa carrot and backhanded and anything you want to say. It's not the rabbi being very straightforward with like, I have a nice mitzvah here for you to do. I know you haven't been, totally keeping Shabbos. Why don't you give it a try? This is the rabbis of the Talmud putting in the nations of the world the question to God, who's putting them on trial. Are we the ones that accepted Torah and don't fulfill it? It's kind of like taking a look at the nations of the world who are taking a look at the Jewish way of life that says, yeah, it's all written over there in that book. But tell me something. I got these neighbors, and they're not so careful with 3 sets of dishes. who knows what, like there was supposed to be a third for par. You're blaming us for not doing Torah when this is how they live. And, that kind of trope over the ages also remains within the Jewish outlook, within the Jewish frame of thought, and within the Jewish framework of approaching the idea of revelation, accepting Torah, living a life of mitzvot. So anyway, the nations of the world are the ones saying it here in that kind of backhanded way. And of course, they're kind of challenging God, who is challenging them as Jews do. Like, you're supposed to, guys, know what's in the Torah. How could you be living a life like this if we know in Torah it says chai behem, that life is the holiest? If we know in the Torah the Jewish values are you're going to return the cloak of the laborer, and you're going to be fair to the ones who work for you, and you're going to pay them on time, and that we really don't want to see slavery anymore in the world, and indentured servitude to pay off a debt, well, that just suggests a way for financial fairness and goodness in the world, where we have societies building on the good life. That we use these as founding principles, and we derive ways of bringing the good life and the civil society into existence. This is at the core. And they say, how are we supposed to really fulfill any of this? We didn't accept it. We didn't reject it. And so is it really a responsibility we have? But the Gemara will go on and say, Ba'al da tivrar ton. Here, I'm down here. But this itself serves as a refutation of their own claim. Amai lo kibalutuha. Why didn't you accept it? God might say, well, don't tell me you didn't accept it, or are we the ones who didn't accept it? Don't tell me you didn't accept it. Ela kachomim lefanav, Ribbono shel olam, klum chafita aleinu harchagit v'lo kibalanua, k'mo she'asita liYisrael. Rather, this is what the nations of the world are going to say. When they say to God, listen, we didn't accept it. We didn't need to accept it. It's not like we rejected it. So what mitzvahs do we have to do? God says, okay, what's the story here? What are we talking about? And then the nations of the world go on and they say, let me tell you something further. If you really wanted us to accept it, you would have turned the mountain on its head, just like you did with the Jewish people. And you would have forced us to accept it. Right? Did you really turn the mountain over like you did to the Jewish people and make them accept the Torah? Did you do that for us? Did you do that to us? So that's really where the Gemara is going. And now, again, the nations of the world are being shown these people who understand what the story is behind the Jews receiving Torah. This is another place within the Talmud where the story of revelation and the story of the Jews receiving and accepting Torah is retold in that way that we bring up a lot of times at Shavuot, where God turns this mountain, turns Sinai over like a basin, as if it's going to be a grave for the Jewish people if they don't accept Torah. And so the question, are you going to accept this? Or are you going to accept that you're finished? Is really the operative question at Revelation. And so they say, Naseh v'nishma. They say, we will do this, we will hear this, we will learn this, we will observe this, we will accept the Torah on us. But the nations of the world now seem to know all this in the background. The Gemara provides the proof for that part of the story. As it's written, they stood at the nether part of the mountain. Rav Dimi Bar Chama melamed shekapah HaKadosh Baruch Hu har kegigit al Yisrael. Rav Dimi Bar Chama says it teaches that the Holy One turned the mountain over the Jews he held it above them like a big bathtub, almost like a wash basin, or like a big, mountainous yarmulke, and says to them, Im atem mekablin et Torah, if you accept the Torah, excellent, mutav. Ve'im la'av, and if you don't accept the Torah, sham tehei kevuratchem, there will be your burial place. And the nations of the world will claim that they too could have been coerced to accept the Torah. So they're going to thrust this midrash as defense that if God would have held it over their heads and then demanded that they either say yay to the Torah, yes, we're going to do it here, yes, we're going to receive it, yes, we're going to live it, that God might have a case. But since God did that only with one nation, and that's the real essence of Revelation, not that God went around to everybody in the world, in all these other places, but that was the moment. They're going to hold it now against God and demand that God understand he has no claim against them. So here's the quick summary of that little section before we get on to the next one. The rest of the nations of the world come. It's not presented like with Rome and with Persia, one nation after the other. The whole set of peoples come forward and say, listen, we weren't like them. You got to give us some credit. God says, but did you really fulfill the Torah? They say, were we the ones to accept Torah to begin with? Could you really hold us accountable? There's absolutely no reason for you to hold us accountable for this. You didn't give us the Torah. You didn't ask us if we wanted it even. Wait a minute, didn't ask you, you wanted it? I went to Seir, I went to Paran. I shopped this Torah around. That's the only way that we hear it in this version. That is an intertext to a different midrash we're going to look at in a minute that has a very different tone to it. Left out of this one, by the way, it would be interesting because I'd expect the tone of the midrash we're going to look at to actually all be in here, but it's not here. But just keep that in mind as what we're going to get to. Wait a minute, you went to all those places, the people say? According to this, the short version of that midrash that God shopped the Torah to those other places is rejected. They move on and they say, hey, wait a minute. It wasn't shopped around to all those other people. You brought it directly to Israel. And by the way, when you brought it to Israel, we know what you did. You actually held Mount Sinai over them. And you said you want to either be buried here or you want to accept the Torah. The mountains over their heads. And they say, Naseh v'nishma, we'll do it, we'll hear it. The peoples of the world are saying, you could have convinced us just like that too. But you didn't. So how are you asking us if we studied your Torah? How are you demanding that we fulfill the words and laws of your Torah when it's really not something that you ever really demanded or even had some way of suggesting that our communities, our peoples, are really responsible for? Thoughts, questions before I go on to show you those other midrashim? These two texts that we just looked at in the Gemara are parallels to other parts of rabbinic literature that tell the story in a little bit of a different way. Yeah, Rich.
Just comment that, in other words, God made the Jews an offer they couldn't refuse.
That's a good way to say it. And if you say that with enough, our neighbors, the Italians, that's kind of like, God the mafioso is a trope here. And some people like to really talk about it that way and study that passage. And this other one we're going to look at from Shabbos, and we'll see. That added, see if any more of that flavor comes out in the parallel text. Other thoughts, questions? All right, let's take a look at these. So there's two texts that are intertexts, meaning once I am reading here in AvodahZarahpp where we are, my hypertext mind as a Jew goes to these other two places. Share the screen here. I'm going to bring forward a document from Sfaria. Okay, so the original, probably the original Midrash, by way of, if you're doing form studies, critical form studies, probably this is earlier in some strata of this Midrash, but there's probably some late additions. So this is a very interesting, if we were doing a presentation of this Sugya, and I could show you what strata are early, what strata are later, if that interested us, it would be very interesting. We would make all kinds of different colors and show you how this text was probably woven together by the time Sikta Rabati, where it's from, gets developed. I'm not going to do that tonight, but it would be an interesting exercise. But here's what it says. This is what came to God's mind. B'techila halach lo etzel b'nei Esau. He went to Esau and the children of Esau. Amar lahem. He says to them, God says, Mikablim atem et Torah? Will you receive the Torah and keep the Torah? Amru lefanav. They say to him, Ribono shel olam, ma kativ ba. So this is going to be the pattern. What's written in it? Say the children of Esau. Amar lehem lo tirtzach. It says the commandment to thou shalt not murder. Amru lo v'chol atzmam shelo tama anashim v'lo hivticham avihem elo ala cherev. They say, but we're supposed to live and die by our sword. And how could we agree to the commandment, thou shalt not kill? Because it says in Genesis, by your swords you will live. Al charbecha tichyeh. At least they're honest. I mean, let's put it that way. Ein anu yecholim lekabel et Torah. We are not able to receive the Torah. That's the Esau clan. Achar kach, what happens after that? Halach etzel b'nei Ammon. God goes to the Ammonites. Amar lahem, God says, Mikablim atem et Torah? Do you accept the Torah? Amru lefanav, they say before him, Ribono shel olam, ma katav ba. What is written in it? Amar lahem, God says to them, Lo tinaf. You should have no explicit relations, no sexual aggression, and no explicit relations, no adultery. Amru lo v'chol atzmam shel otam anashim einam ba'im ela min yuf. But we know that it was adulterous relations that actually were the beginnings of their people, and that they have to tell the story. And how can that be a commandment that they can uphold and not say has some place in the world? And it was the whole question of Lot's daughters. So they aren't able to receive the Torah. After that, halach lo etzel b'nei Yishmael. He goes to the Ishmaelites. Amar lehem mikablim atem et Torah. Do you accept the Torah? Amru lefana. They say to him, Ribono shel olam, ma k'tiv ba. What's written in your Torah? Amar lehem lo tignov. We have the commandment. God says, you shall not steal. Amru lo kol atzmam shelo tam anashim einam chayim ela mina gneva umina gezel. These people live only according to what they steal and what can be taken by thieves. Hadahu dichtiv, as it's written, Yehyeh paradam, to be a wild people, and they'll shoot and thrust their wild hands at others. We're not able to receive the Torah. We can't ever live up to that standard. And after that, God came to Israel. Amrulo, And they said to him, Naseh v'nishma, we shall do it and we shall learn it. You see how I translated by way of Gemara language? We shall learn it. Why do we translate nishma as we shall learn it? Because there's a very famous phrase in rabbinic Hebrew, ta shema, come and learn. Shma'ata, I have a learning, right? One hears when one learns something from oral Torah. The way of learning in our culture is an oral Torah. We repeat things time and again. We're mishanen. Mishnah actually really means vishinan tam levanecha vidibar tabam. You shall repeat them again and again to your children, learn orally, and speak of them to your children. That's from the Kriyat Shema. That's why I'm going into Torah True. And that is the way that Jews learn. And when the Jews said we'll do, they said we'll do, and we'll keep learning. We'll learn what you need us to do. So, I did have the translations. Good. So Esau with killing. Ammonites say no, because adulterous beginnings is their story. Yishmaelites stealing, but the Israelites will do and will hear. Now, that had its parallel with the small section that talked about going to Paran and Seir in our Talmud. You see how that worked? Seir and Paran were not mentioned over here in the Pesikta Rabbati. The one I just read you did not have those two. So we could say that these two texts are in dialogue with each other, but they're not totally parallel. They're intertextual because they have the same theme. They're in dialogue because they're different nations either accepting or rejecting. But they're not parallel texts rabbinically, which I use technically, because a parallel text kind of tells the story and might add or have a little more or a little less when I use it, okay? So over in Avodah Zarah, given the nature of our sugya, I might have expected, like if I was writing an article about this passage in Avodah Zarah and including this other text that we just read, I might say, wow, I would have thought that the authors or the editors of our sugya in Avodah Zarah might have picked up on this kind of negativity about other nations that exists in the Pesikta text that we just saw. But actually, that's not the point over at this place in our sugya. What's really important to the editors and the writers of our sugya is that the nations of the world are starting to get a chap on God and on the Jewish people. Like, are we really obligated? Oh, Jews who have a chiyuv, like they're talking almost like they understand halachic frameworks of living, almost like they understand Jewish frameworks of God's engagement with the Jewish people. And they're saying, we don't have the same agreement here. We're not the children of your covenant, God. You can't hold us accountable the way that you could hold other people accountable. And by the way, you think you went to everybody else. Fine. You went to everybody else, but you made Jews accept and receive Torah by holding a mountain over their head. Like they weren't going to take it either. So I might have thought that the writers of Avodah Zarah, the editors of Avodah Zarah, the constructors of the story, would have been negative because they were so negative about Rome. They're so negative about Persia. It's really about putting the world on trial. But in a certain way here, the turn comes. And it's not about only the nations of the world. We're actually challenged here to say, did we receive this with love? Did we receive this willingly? Did we not? And if the nations of the world were presented the opportunity, would they have? Now, that very ending piece about the mountain being held over our heads, there is a parallel source instead of just being in dialogue. And that's what we're going to look at now. And most of the time when that source comes into focus, we look at the Shabbat version. And so I'm going to take us to Masechet Shabbat now, and we're going to see this story unfold over there in Masechet Shabbat, in Tractate Shabbat, versus here in AvodahZarahpp. Back to the Sefaria source. So it's on Shabbat 88, and I'm going to read it in the translation. Gemara cites an additional homiletic interpretation on the topic of revelation. This is actually a section in the Talmud about the revelation of Torah. And again, the first sugi that we're learning in AvodahZarahpp has so much rich material that some of the foundational questions, right? Jews versus who are we in the world versus who are they? In other words, how do we differentiate ourselves? What kind of experience do we really see ourselves having in the world? Does Torah stem to others, or is it only ours? And revelation as a question. Every Jew has to decide what's the relationship I have with Torah, let alone with God. But Torah as at the center. And some Jews fight and struggle with this relationship. Some versions of Revelation, they use lots of verses from Shir HaShirim. Let's say I was in the garden and God was kissing me on the lips, and I was getting the language, and I was feeling really close, and I was feeling really, like loved. That's one version of Revelation. In Masechet Shabbat and in other places in Torah and Talmud, we have the stories of how this works. The magnificent nature turned over on its head itself. The thunder that you can see, the lightning that you can hear, the fantastical descriptions of Revelation. But here's another version of Revelation. And this is the version that was mentioned in AvodahZarahpp. The rest of the world kind of knows the story. And this is one version we see for ourselves. And this might explain some of our fraught relationship with Torah. We can have a fraught relationship at the same time that we can fancy it. We can feel total passion for it and love for Torah. And at the same time, maybe a little bit of duress. And here's the duress. So God says, Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain. Now, some people say about this verse, that lowermost, that this is like the lowermost sense of, whoops, let me get rid of that. That this is the lowermost, that this is the lowermost sense of revelation. Yeah. Not behaving so nicely.
I have it right on here.
Oh, that's good. All right, so they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chasa says, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. It wasn't the lowest part. It's actually there beneath it. And the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. And if not, there will be your burial. Now that is what's in our AvodahZarahpp. Right? Keeps going though. Rabbi Achabar Yaakov said from here, there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people could claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it is therefore not binding. I kept the idiomatic translation because there are those Rishonim who went this direction. They wanted to know, as a matter of Lamdanish kind of Torah, in other words, to ask the Shaila and not be afraid to ask the Shaila, doesn't it mean if we were coerced to receive the Torah, that we have an argument against God for actually having to keep the Torah? Because if you're coerced into something, do you rightfully say that the partner is given consideration and that the contract is good? So interesting, the Gemara in and of itself, at the very moment the story is told over here in Shabbat, says about the Jews they might even have an ability to challenge. And the writers of AvodahZarahpp know this. The writers of AvodahZarahpp know that maybe the Jews themselves are even thinking, when God comes to ask us, did you keep the Torah? When God comes to ask us, Have you done right in my world through the Torah's teachings? The Jews could ultimately say, what? Like the rest of the nations of the world might be able to? Did you really ask us if we wanted the Torah? Or did you hold the mountain over our heads and say, there you die, or there you accept it? Right? So that's a piece of the Jewish neshama. That's a piece of the Jewish consciousness. That's a religious outlook of the Jewish people intertwined with other senses of revelation. Because again, I can accept revelation wholeheartedly. Torah mi Sinai. From Sinai, God grants us Torah, kisses me on the mouth, brings me the beautiful teachings that are like flowers in the garden, all kinds of metaphorical representations of what revelation really is and what it stands for. And this one stands too, that God overturned the mountain on our head. So Rava says, even so, and here's where we say we have ancestors who, even if our first ancestors were coerced into it, here's where by free will and agency, I really know that the Torah is my responsibility and that it's covenantally confirmed by a different generation. And look in what empire, look in what, amidst what people this happens. Now you're going to read this story in Shabbat. You might have even learned this sugya before with someone about revelation, but you've never read this sugya in parallel with Avodah Zarah like this, where you know that one of the empires that was on trial was from Persia, right? That they were the Persians. But this next part of this passage in Shabbat is during the Persian Empire. It's by the reign of the Persians. So I'll ask you, what do you make of this next claim, given the fact that the Persians were the second to be on trial over in our Gemara in Avodah Zarah? But we'll get back to that. Think about this. Here's what they said. You can't really claim that it was just coercion, because Rava adds, even so, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh. As it's written, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. As he taught, the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Sinai. So that in the Hebrew is quoting from Esther. And here is what it is. Amar Rava, Afa Pichein, Hador Kabaluha B'Yemei Achashverosh. They came and they accepted it in the days of Achashverosh, who's obviously a Persian king. Dichti, when the Persian Empire was building, Kimu v'Kiblu HaYehudim. They firmly established and accepted upon themselves, the Jews, all this Torah. Kimu Masha Kiblu Kvar. They established and affirmed what had been accepted upon the Jewish people from before. The sugya kind of goes on, this little section goes on, and said, the Jews, after establishing that, Chizkiah says, what's the meaning of that which is written? You caused sentence to be heard from heaven, the earth feared and was silent. If it was afraid, why was it silent? And if it was silent, why was it afraid? Rather, the meaning is at first it was afraid, and in the end it was silent. You caused sentence to be heard from heaven, refers to the revelation. And why was the earth afraid? It is in accordance with the statement of Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish says, what's the meaning of that which is written? And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Why do I require the superfluous letter Hey, the definite article, which doesn't appear Hashishi instead of just the regular number? It teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, established a condition with the act of creation and said to them, and here this whole creation depends on Israel accepting Torah, according to this passage. If Israel accepts the Torah on the 6th of Sivan, you will exist. And if they do not accept it, I will return you to the primordial state of chaos and disorder. Now, let me put that into the mix. When the Avodah Zarah people were writing, and they were seeing that the end of the passage about revelation that was received and established again by the Jewish people in the time of the Persian Empire goes all the way back to creation and says, why is it Yom HaShishi, Ha-Shishi, and not Chamishi, Yom Chamishi, or Yom Shlishi, Ha-Shishi? Because it is the day, the sixth day. It also has a certain kind of yontif quality into it, if you really went with this Shabbos kind of thing. And it got a lot of people talking about what does it mean to be a Yom HaShishi Jew versus just a Shabbos Jew. That when you create a Shabbos, when you said yes, Jewish people, that you were going to receive the Torah, all the rest of the world could be established in historical realities the way that we understand historical realities today, the unfolding of human history, the unfolding of creation as we know it. If you would have said no, by the way, creation would have gone back to chaos and disorder. And God says that in full earshot of humanity at the time, without there even being the first Jew around. So humanity knows that the Jews have a very big role to play according to Gemara Shabbos. What role do the Jews have to play? That when they accept Torah, and the people then of the world accept that the Jews accept Torah, and that the Jews need a place and a space, time and physical space, cultural kind of acceptance to fulfill Torah. Then and only then the world stays in order. Otherwise, it goes back to chaos. The attitude being reflected, by the way, in that statement in Shabbos is a little bit like the attitude that, again, is a pretty permanent Jewish outlook for thousands of years. If the world would embrace a little bit more Torah, the world might be in, a little less in a state of tohu vavohu, a little less in a state of chaos and disorder. And without it, we're in trouble. But moving backwards through, what part is the only part that was in Avodah Zarah? The coercion. It was held against God to say, you didn't ask us. You didn't even try to coerce us. They didn't understand all the rest of this that's in Shabbos, but the Jewish mind that goes to the text in Shabbos knows there's a lot more dynamic statement being made by the author of Avodah Zarah. Because the author of Avodah Zarah knows it and says, you see, the Jews did accept it willingly, so don't try to use that excuse. And if the Jews hadn't accepted it, I don't know where you guys would be. There would be total tohu vavohu already in this crazy world of empires and bloodshed that you guys have created. And for no good, in other words, because Persians and Romans, we heard from you. Rich, I'll let you start and get other people's thoughts and questions too. Go.
You're on mute.
He's unmuting. Carefully get the button. No, not that button.
Okay, there we go.
He doesn't hear me because
There we
have
go.
a
I don't know
microphone.
what, somehow my space bar didn't work on
Yeah,
that one
I hear
for
you.
some reason. I've heard this story about the Jews accepting the willingly the Torah, so in the Esther story, usually cited around Purim, but I don't know where that's evidenced in the story. I mean, what is the evidence that the Jews willingly accepted Torah at that point?
Well, the verse that's brought forward as evidence is Kimu v'kiblu, and that's in chapter 9 of the Megillah. And so since there was that phrase, kiblu, the verb is there, we kind of see that as suggesting that Kabbalat HaTorah happened. The Kabbalat HaTorah and the framework of reception of Torah, and that they kiyamu, the words of Esther, who got her Jewish consciousness on, kind of said, oh yes, because I created this Jewish consciousness and outlook, and I saved my people, and I needed to be the kind of Jewish soul that I know I am in the world now and embrace that. we use that as the framework to say it was done consciously, it was done for lifting our people, for protecting our people, for establishing our people. And then what does that lead to? Why is it so interesting that it happens with Esther and with the Persians? Because what are the Persians ultimately, in other words, the Gemara already said this too, what could they claim? That they saw how incredible the real prophecy and the real path of Jewish history could and should be, and Cyrus is the one to let us back to the land, right? I mean, the claim that they can make, which we heard finally when we expected it the first time, it wasn't there, but it was there the second go around with Persia. Like, we even let them rebuild the house of Solomon, the Temple of Solomon. So all of it is now connected, and Revelation, in essence, which is connected here to Esther and the Jews of that time, is really not only connected to Revelation. The point is, it's connected to the possibility of history, to the possibility of a world that unfolds with multiple peoples, and that it could be orderly and it could be full of morality. That I think is a big chiddush, reading these two texts together. Ari's gonna speak up.
I can put it on the mic.
Oh, you're good. People can see you without.
Okay,
No,
when
can you
is-
hear Ari with the regular mic that's in the room? All right, good.
when the golden calf story, is that before or after the coercion? Because it would appear that they didn't want to accept it at the time. So where are we going? Because when they finally got to the point that they were being coerced, I see there's a problem here.
Yeah, well, now Ari's getting into mega problems of the Torah. Let's take a poll. Who thinks the golden calf happened before the revelation of the Torah? Anyone? Even though it's in chapter 32, and the revelation story begins what? Chapter, we're going to say 18, 19 in Exodus. There are commentators who agree with people who are raising their hand, like the golden calf had to happen before Torah because we needed it as a fix on our idol worship. The second commandment being, don't worship any of it. On the other hand, those people who like to point out that it could be just the other way, say we get the 10 commandments, we get the Torah, and then all of a sudden, immediately,
Rejected.
we either total rejection or we can't live up to the expectations in it. And it's going to be a process because it's really easy to revert to your old ways. So the question of timing is a complex one. Mefarshim are in total disagreement. Commentators have different conceptions of the timing. And we could go into a whole source sheet about which commentators say it's before or after. But the Rashi principle is ein mukdam ve'ein mu'achar b'Torah. There's no earlier and no later in the Torah when it comes to some of these narratives. Some pieces are put in where they're put in to teach a lesson, and that it's not a diachronic history. That's at least Rashi, and that's what gets everybody talking. Diane or Aaron or both.
So one comment on the golden calf. I mean, in the narrative, the people are getting restless, and so where's Moses? And we don't, whatever he's doing, we don't buy into it, and that's why we have the golden calf. But my question is, and pardon me because I haven't been consistent in Talmud study, but is part of this narrative of the one nation, says, did you offer us Torah? Well, you're adulterers. Is that part of like the morality lesson, reinforcing the morality lesson of the reason why the Jews got the Torah is because we're teaching morality and you're expected to live up to these morals?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely statement, and the different face of the same kind of gemstone that I'm trying to cut here. As we study texts, we see some of the underlying outlooks and philosophies and potential curricula to develop when it comes to our Torah. And how I'm going to ultimately teach this is through text that challenges those other nations. In this sense, the question is, should this be a text that's used, right? Because it seems to cast aspersions on other peoples. And is that really a way we do business any longer? Back at the time of the Midrash, to plant this text in a positive historical vein, they had no problem really saying about those folks or these folks or this group that they're known to have said this. They're known to have said, well, we need to live by the sword. We need to steal. I think we're a little bit more sensitive to that. But on the other hand, on the positive side, I think your point is exactly the way we would say if we were writing a 301 level paper on the purposes of Midrash. You could use the kind of opening to your section on the purposes of demeaning another people. It is really a morality play. And let's talk about what that morality play looks like. And that is, in a certain sense, what I'm suggesting the first sugya in Avodah Zarah is all about. And it's not just about the other nations of the world, but you see how it's taking a turn in its presentation, if we read it closely enough, to actually challenge the way Jews think about themselves as B'nai Torah themselves, as a people of the book. So yes, that's not everybody's way of studying Talmud, by the way. Don't worry that you did or you didn't have it. That's us as an Or Zarua Beit Midrash reading deeply and teasing this out over the years. Because I read this a lot more literarily than I do just the technical versions of Talmud study. And I think that's one of the features of studying together here, making this kind of study happen.
Thank you. It reminds me of discussions with Rabbi Wexler about that you shouldn't, when you're raising a child, for instance, point out behaviors of other people unless it's something that is not right, and you're allowed to point that out and say to your child, don't behave like that.
I think this text, and yes, in that way of making examples of people, which we do, by the way, in the newspapers, which we do on the police blotters, and which we do by way of showing folks sometimes what it means to behave in a way that's unbecoming. That sometimes you must say it can happen to an individual. Here, look, that happened to an individual. Individual responsibility is much different than the nature of an entire people. And I think we've done a lot of work in the world to try not to stereotype. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of a discussion I was in today on the Facebook lines with a colleague of ours. And someone posted a wonderfully inspiring picture of a few guys in a pair of, must have been Wrangler jeans. You know how you can just tell, like, from dungarees which ones are which? Like, I don't know, stop. But visually, they were in cowboy hats and they were in flannels. This was, by all means, a group of cowboys. You knew that. And they were going to dispatch. They had decided to go help on horseback, patrol the Jewish fields now that the Shomer HaTzair, that this group in northern Israel goes around with their horses, and they make sure that no one comes and steals the crops. And they were going to go, and they were from Montana, and they're not members of the tribe. But what kind of folks really are organizing to do this right now? Right? Which Westerners in the United States are going to help in Israel? The evangelical crowds. You don't know what kind of volunteers are already being mobilized to go take the place of farmers and patrolmen and rustlers when it comes to our herds. I mean, it's amazing. Okay, it's something I'm following. I happen to follow a few moderate evangelicals. I know that sounds a little crazy, but it's not crazy. There are moderate evangelicals. And so one of my colleagues writes, don't celebrate these guys. they're all speaking about Jews as if we should be, saved from hell when we're not in the same room from them. And I said, let me just shine some light. I've actually, at many different kinds of conferences that I've attended, met some folks who truly believe that in their evangelical outlooks, Jews have an interesting self-determining destiny in the world today, as opposed to being just a remnant and evidence that there's, quote unquote, a covenant that was broken with God. And it really is like a reformed view that came out of Vatican II. It really is something they're grappling with religiously. And even if they're just grappling with it and don't really accept it, I want to just admire the fact that they could get there and that they're supporters of Zion in a more passionate way, with money and time and willingness to be in the line of fire and missiles in today's world, for redemption or not for redemption. And another colleague of mine said the same thing before I really had the time to post, as I'm writing my post. And I got to give a little like. And so, here's to one positive version of the use of social media, by the way. But moreover, within and among a group of people, there are those who represent everything that the stereotype is all about, and we've done these stereotypes for a reason. But on the other hand, we have done great work in the world to try to do some work about individual agency and responsibility, and not hold stereotypes as the only kind of way to describe the nations of the world or the groups of people that we live amongst. I think especially in America, this is a positive value. And we try to classify, our comments in, is this just coming from the assumptions that I've been taught and I swallowed? Can I see how to parse this in a little bit of a different way? Could I ask a question that could help me point out the really kind of problematic position of such a soul, if we got down to it, brass tacks? Yeah. Could I, though, give a benefit of the doubt to say maybe there's some level of understanding that I could come up with this person? And that's a long-winded response to people who really just digest that all the Ishmaelites are thieves. Whatever you want to call an Ishmaelite today or not. I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. And as hard as it is to think about it on this intellectual level right now, and I do want to say that it's a little bit difficult for me to think this deeply intellectually about our neighbors who live near us in the land of Israel, who are living near my daughter and son, who live near us in New York, who are planning a 30 high school walkout, by the way, on Monday, pro-Palestine. And God forbid their flags say from the river to the sea, and this city allows that kind of genocidal diatribe to be free speech, because I think that's where it ends. But I don't want to completely put collective association of guilt with everyone. I was proud today that the Israeli tank was protecting the line of Gazan civilians from the Hamas butchers who were shooting at their own people and not letting them out of North Gaza when we said, move, we have to get rid of these terrorists, right? But today the tanks were protecting the Gazan exodus out of Hamas land, or Hamasatan.
Where was that in the news?
That was in the news, and I posted it on my Instagram. And there's a beautiful video done by a young woman who's saying, this is your genocide, folks. Israeli tanks protecting the people who don't deserve to be held hostage by their own Hamasistan. So, yeah, long-winded, but we're in the midst of a sugya about the nations of the world and what's going on. So thanks, Diane, for letting me have that launching pad.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions? All right, so let's look. what's going to happen? Here we go. Back to the Gemara. So then there's a quick turn, and this discussion about Revelation and how they either had to accept it, not accept it, did have a chance to receive it, didn't really feel like it was their responsibility. God takes a turn and says, fine, I can't hold you accountable for the whole Torah. Let me at least get some proof from you guys that you held up your end of the bargain that is something you are obligated for, because your father Noah accepted a certain covenant, and I made a pact at that time with good old Father Noah. And we have what's called the Noahide laws, which are referred to as the first things in our tradition. I don't know if you've ever heard that. You probably have heard of the Noahide laws, but you should also know that when someone says, well, you're responsible for the first things, it really is a term from Isaiah that refers back to the Noahide laws, which make up the Noahide covenant. And so God says, fine, you want to tell me you're not responsible for the whole Torah? You want to tell me I could have made you responsible by holding you accountable? But you know that you're accountable for the first things. You know you're accountable for the Noahide mitzvah. So could you at least prove to me, show me that you learned those, that you upheld those, that you engaged and embraced those? So let's read inside the Gemara, and then I'll show you what the Noahide laws are from a section in Sanhedrin that you have to know in order to understand what the first things are, right? If you don't remember them all. So we'll look quickly at again, hypertext. As soon as you start to hear this kind of stuff, your mind as a Jew goes to the other Gemara you're supposed to know, and the story of Noah and the Torah, where there was a covenant made. And the only thing you can see is a rainbow, probably, right? Because how can you remember every time you've got a textual challenge? But this is what Jewish life is. So he says, Miyad omer lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So immediately God says to them, Harishonot yashmiunu. Let the first mitzvot really be learned out here in this court. Let's hear you testify about the first mitzvot. Shenemar Varishonot yashmiunu. Hello? 9 o'clock. Okay. 9 o'clock. So let the first ones. Sheva mitzvot shekibaltim heichan kiyamtim. Let's talk about those 7 mitzvot you did accept. And where's the proof you fulfilled those? So God and the Jewish way of thinking about these people comes and says, all right, fine. You didn't receive the whole Torah. You don't have the 613 mitzvahs. You don't have all the halachas, all the Jewish law that stemmed from those 613. You got at least the 7. So now, in a certain way, and here's the funky thing, so fine, you beat me. You didn't totally get off, though, scot-free. You didn't get off with nothing you're responsible for, because you know that you accepted through Noah, because you told me that there was a transmission. You admitted that there's generational acceptance of Torah if you were bringing me those stories about the Jews receiving it. And you know full well, nations of the world, what you were saying. And Jews, you know that we're talking about from the original generation who received Torah to the generation of Esther who received it again, to all of the generations who have to accept Torah. You know that you have 7 mitzvahs that were already accepted back when. So tell me, did you fulfill those? At least those? And where did we derive that they did not fulfill them? Uminalan de lo kiumu. And we have this thought, and God has to have this thought that maybe they didn't even live up to fulfilling the 7 Noahide laws. And so there's where we're going to just stop and go, what were the Noahide laws that they had to fulfill? That is a Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's a short little one, and it says, Tanu Rabbanan, Sheva mitzvot nitztavu b'nei Noach. 7 mitzvahs were commanded to all of humanity. B'nei Noach can be translated as descendants of Noah. It can also be humanity. Dinin u'virchat Hashem, AvodahZarahpp, Gilui arayot, u'shfichu damim, v'gezel ve'ever minachai. Here are the commandments. They have to establish courts of justice. There's a prohibition against blessing. It's lashon sagi nahura, we call it. It's a language that uses the positive to really connote the negative. There's no taking God's name in vain. There's no idol worship. So idol worship becomes something nobody can do, pretty back from the time of Noah. There's no forbidden sexual relationships. There's the prohibition of bloodshed, robbery, and the prohibition of eating limbs from living animals. So here is the basic way, many say, that the covenantal arrangement with a God who demands morality is founded in the world. Some people want to say that the Torah is built upon these 7 mitzvot and is a total expansion. You can find a way to track, like and trace, every mitzvah of Jewish tradition back to some foundational column of the Noahide laws, the 7 different ones. I think that's a futile exercise in futility. I don't really think you can have every mitzvah in our tradition under one of these 7 categories. I think it's not such a healthy kind of way to have to do taxonomic organization of mitzvot. But you get it that in someone claiming that even, here is a foundational moral, shared moral covenant that would, for the world, help people build the kinds of civil society, and even in the empire zone of the way of thinking about empires, help them really establish what could be a way of socializing people and organizing society and keeping a certain type of self-reflection and humility within the world of human beings who had this kind of conscious sense that they had to progress. Law would have to somehow come into being. Courts of judgment and justice would have to progress somehow in adjudicating matters as they came to the courts. Once you put a court into place to deal with the differences and distinctions and cases and differences among people, that's going to get into the human unfolding reality of human history. So you have this respect for God that's driving people towards at least some type of unified sense of morality. They want to get past idol worship in all of what it means to sacrifice to idols. They want to have better kind of relationships. They want to have regulations between and among men and women vis-a-vis killing and murder and violent crime. Property rights become the focus, and ways of eating that are healthier, and ensure that we have a society, getting the nutrients and feeding one another. This is all at the core of what it means to build an empire. These Noahide laws, they all take a stab at what else is in there. Some want to outlaw castration, violent punishment maybe, or thinking that they have to control populations like that. This was some of the barbaric kind of ways that people fought and injured each other, maimed each other. And sorcery becomes a matter of concern because they're dealing with people who understand that life as we know it with memory is different than life as we know it with attaching ourselves to spirits of the dead. When they say sorcery in Talmudic texts and in Torah, what we really mean, first and foremost, is people who believe that they can call upon dead spirits of ancestors in order to get some perspective about how life is going to unfold in the future, or simply that they will be able to really ask guiding questions for the present, and that the dead have some message to send regarding life here in the present. So that kind of what some people call necromancy, what some people call ovot, those people who are the leaders in this, what some people call a witch in the Torah's version, they're not kind of people connected to nature spirits, though we do think about the witches themselves, that they also had a little bit of reliance on nature gods, and that's why we don't put trees close to our altars and things like this. But moreover, the sorcery we're talking about is this kind of connection with the dead spirits. So from this kind of discussion in the Gemara comes the sense of all of these. I'm gonna skip through based on time. Some of what is the bottom line covenant. Turns out that Boston College did a nice source book about Jewish views of the other, and this sugya is classified as one of those sources that is a Jewish source in terms of the potential and the real covenant that all others share with the Jews, based on the fact that it's in Torah. That's the way it was presented at Boston College, and they're quoting the same Sanhedrin source and studying it within a source book about the Jewish outlook of life. So what happened with those first things? Did you fulfill them? Back to our sugya. Well, it must be that God, in challenging the nations of the world, is saying, you probably didn't do such a good job there either. And that's the attitude that the Gemara is going to share with us. Uminala de lo kiyamu. And how do we know that they did not fulfill their covenantal agreement? The Tani Rav Yosef teaches, Amad v'yimoded eretz ra'a v'yeter goyim. He says he stands and shakes the earth, he sees and makes the nations tremble. Ma ra'ah? What did God see that he makes the whole earth tremble? Ra'ah sheva mitzvot shekiblu aleihem b'nei Noach v'lo kiyamum. God saw that the humanity, the children of Noah, accepted upon themselves the 7 mitzvahs, but they did not fulfill them. Kevan shelo kiyamum, because they didn't fulfill them, amad v'hitiran lehem. What did he do? He saw they didn't fulfill, he arose and he nullified the mitzvot for them. Itagur? Do they gain? Should they get any credit then for not obeying them? Being that they were released from the obligation to fulfill them? If so, we find that sinners profit from their transgressions. So last, or if you will, next piece, well, you didn't tell us to accept the whole Torah. You didn't even try to coerce us. We don't have 613 mitzvahs. God turns the corner and says, fine, you had 7 mitzvahs. Did you do 7 mitzvahs? You didn't even do 7 mitzvahs, says the Gemara. How do we know that they didn't do 7 mitzvahs? Because ultimately we have a verse that God saw and made the earth tremble. Why did God make the earth tremble? Because ultimately they weren't fulfilling their 7 covenantal obligations. But didn't they have a heter? Didn't they have, think about this, halachic framework, by the way, towards the goyim. You gotta love this, because, we should have our own frameworks of consciousness that define not only our relationship to them, but they should have a kind of relationship with God. He says, I give you a heter, you don't have to actually fulfill them. So is that going to get them off, or is that going to make them guilty? Says the Gemara. Because if you say that really makes them innocent in the end, even though they had a heter not to fulfill them, then we could conclude that what? A sinner who's given a pass would be benefiting from his sin. Now, this is an internal critical piece as well. With this, we'll end tonight, and we're going to finish the sugya the next time we meet. Jews sometimes like to feel like, but I had a heter for that. Let me ask you, Rabbi, is it permissible for me to just eat on Yom Kippur this year? Because I have this little, now, to say that you have a real issue medically, and to say that a doctor should prescribe you the fact that you should eat, and to say we have a system in the Mishnah that tells you how to eat on Yom Kippur, if you need to eat on Yom Kippur, because we believe in life and not death, that's part of halacha. But if someone comes and says, I have a little headache, shouldn't I be able to eat? And you want to really gain from such a thing, because you got a head there, right? I'll ask the right rabbi in terms of the question I have and when I need that permission. This is the kind of question that's inherently about the Jews and not really about the nations of the world. And so, folks, there's a critical analysis of the peoples of the earth, but there's also a self-criticism going on within this sugya, a recognition of both the fraught relationship and the fancy relationship Jews have with Torah, and the way we fancy it, the way we hold it dear. And the drama is unfolding that the Umot Olam, they have a little bit of the Lashon. These nations of the world have a little bit of the knowledge of who we are and what we are. So there are people who we're close with and who know our nature as human beings as well. And all of us as human beings are striving to do the best by God we can. And that's the ultimate end of where we're going to get. That's the foreshadowing for the next time. Tov, Lila Tov, great learning with you.
Lila Tov, thank you very much.
Laila Tov, thank you.
All right. See you soon.
This is so